Atlanta, spring of 1998. The morning air carried a damp heaviness, the kind that clung to the skin and made every breath feel slower than it should have been. I stood by the mirror in my bedroom, adjusting the black tie that refused to sit straight, as if even the fabric itself knew what kind of day lay ahead. Funerals in our community were not just moments of mourning. They were spectacles, public reckonings where people came dressed not only in their best suits and dresses but also in their judgments, whispers, and sharp glances. Today was no different. My husband, Clarence, was gone, and the church pews would be filled with faces I hadn't seen in years, faces that carried both pity and suspicion. Clarence was respected, admired even, a man whose smile could charm a room, whose words always seemed smoother than honey. But behind closed doors the sweetness had its cracks. I knew it better than anyone. Marriage to Clarence had been a balance of love and betrayal, comfort and cold nights, devotion and suspicion. Still, death has a way of making even the bitterest truth taste different. The coffin would erase the wrongs in the eyes of many, polishing him into a saint before the dirt covered him. And I, as his wife, was expected to stand tall, wear the mask of dignity, and pretend none of the bruises on my heart existed. The church stood on Auburn Avenue, a proud red brick building with stained glass windows that caught the morning light and spilled it across the cracked pavement. As I stepped out of the car, people turned their heads, their eyes heavy with rehearsed sorrow. Women in wide hats and men with polished shoes moved toward the doors, clutching hymnals and tissues. Some came out of respect, others out of curiosity, and a few just to make sure they didn't miss the show. The coffin sat at the front, draped in white lilies and roses, a sharp contrast to the man I remembered. The smell was overpowering, as if flowers could choke out the truth. I walked down the aisle, my heels echoing in the hollow silence before the choir began. Every step felt like it belonged to someone else. I wasn't sure if I was a grieving widow or an unwilling actress in a drama I had rehearsed for far too long. The choir started a hymn, voices rising and falling, washing over me in waves that felt more like accusations than comfort. I sat in the front pew, hands folded tightly in my lap, eyes fixed on the coffin but seeing only the past. Clarence had lived two lives, one for me and another in the shadows. I had felt it, suspected it, but I never imagined how boldly it would come to the surface on the very day I buried him. The church doors opened midway through the service, a late arrival that sent a ripple through the congregation. A woman stepped inside, tall, striking, dressed in a black dress that shimmered slightly under the dim lights. But it wasn't her presence alone that drew every eye. Beside her walked a boy, no older than 7, his small hand gripping hers tightly, his wide eyes scanning the room with a mixture of fear and confusion. Gasps whispered through the pews, the kind of sound that spreads like fire when dry leaves catch the flame. I felt the weight of every gaze turned toward me, waiting for my reaction, waiting to see if the widow would crumble or keep her spine straight. The woman's chin lifted, her stride slow but steady, as if she knew this moment was hers, not mine. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She led the boy down the aisle, closer and closer to the coffin, closer to me, and closer to the storm that was about to break. My heart thudded in my chest, not from grief but from the confirmation of a truth I had never wanted to face so publicly. The boy's face bore the unmistakable features of Clarence. His eyes, his cheekbones, even the way his hair curled at the edges. The congregation didn't need a DNA test. Their murmurs already carried the verdict. I clenched my jaw, forcing my body to remain still, but inside, a fire was consuming me. The preacher paused, his voice faltering for a moment before he regained his rhythm, but the spell of the ceremony was broken. Everyone knew this was no longer just a funeral, it was a revelation. The woman settled into a pew near the middle, the boy climbing onto the bench beside her. She held him close, her hand stroking his hair as if daring anyone to question his place in that church. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from the strain of holding back everything I wanted to scream. Betrayal had walked through the church doors hand in hand with innocence, and now the whole city would carry the story in their pockets like loose change, passing it from one gossip to the next. I kept my gaze on the coffin, but all I could see was the boy's face, a living testament to Clarence's secrets. Death had not silenced him, it had amplified his sins. And this was only the beginning, because when the lawyer read the will, I already sensed that the real storm would make today's revelation look like a drizzle. The funeral ended with hymns and polite condolences, though the air inside that church felt charged with something sharper than grief. People pretended to mourn, but their eyes kept darting toward the woman and the boy, like moths circling a flame they couldn't resist. I walked out slowly, my heels sinking into the damp ground outside the church, the sun breaking through clouds in a way that felt almost mocking. Death was supposed to bring closure, but all it had done was open a door I never wanted anyone to see behind. The line of cars formed for the procession, and I slipped into the back seat of the black sedan, hands folded tight, staring out the window as the city moved past in blurred patches of color. The cemetery was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against your skin until you could feel it in your bones. Clarence's coffin was lowered, prayers were whispered, and earth began to cover him, each shovelful sounding like punctuation to a story I wasn't ready to finish. The woman stood apart, her hand still resting protectively on the boy's shoulder, her face unreadable. I couldn't decide if she was defiant or grieving or perhaps both. The murmurs continued even at the graveside, whispers carried on the wind, each one slicing into me like a blade. When the last handful of soil was thrown and the crowd began to thin, I felt the weight of what was still to come. Funerals were about endings, but wills were about truths, and Clarence had left too many of those hidden while alive. The lawyer's office sat on the corner of Peachtree Street, an old building with tall windows and a brass plaque that had seen decades of families torn apart and stitched back together with ink and signatures. I arrived that afternoon, exhaustion dragging at me, but a strange energy pulling me forward. I had dreaded this day even before Clarence died, because men like him didn't leave the world clean. They left tangled webs that choked everyone left behind. The waiting room was already filled when I stepped inside. Cousins, neighbors, distant relatives who barely spoke to Clarence when he was alive now sat in stiff-backed chairs, whispering like vultures waiting for the carcass to stop twitching. And there once again was the woman, seated near the window with the boy beside her, his feet not reaching the floor. She didn't look up when I entered. She didn't need to. Everyone already knew her place in this story, even if the ink hadn't yet confirmed it. My stomach tightened, my fingers curling into fists I forced open again and again. The lawyer, a thin man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, called us into the conference room. The space was lined with shelves of leather-bound books no one had touched in years, the heavy oak table scarred with the marks of countless battles fought over words written on paper. We took our seats, the air so thick with anticipation it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began. The will was read in a flat, practiced voice, each phrase carefully measured, as though he knew the power of every syllable. Clarence left modest sums to cousins, a portion to a local church, and then came the part that shifted the air in the room. The bulk of his estate, the house, the savings, even his small business, was left not just to me, his lawful wife, but also in trust for the boy. The words landed like stones thrown into still water, rippling outward in widening circles of shock. Gasps broke the silence, heads turned, and all eyes fell on the woman at the window. Her composure cracked in that instant. The strength she carried at the funeral dissolved, her shoulders collapsing, her hand trembling as it gripped the boy's arm. Tears spilled down her face, unrestrained, raw, and sudden. Whatever image she had wanted to project, defiance, dignity, or power, shattered under the weight of those words. The boy sat frozen, staring at her, confusion etched across his small face. He didn't understand inheritance or betrayal, only that his mother was breaking in front of him. The lawyer paused, letting the silence settle like dust after a storm. He explained the trust, the conditions, the way Clarence had tried to balance two lives with one final act. But the details barely reached me. I watched the woman, watched the way her chest shook with each sob, and I felt something I hadn't expected. It wasn't triumph and it wasn't anger. It was pity, sharp and painful. Because whatever Clarence had left me, he had left her nothing but shame, and shame is a heavier burden than money ever could be. The relatives muttered among themselves, some outraged, others gleeful, already planning how they might circle closer to me or to the boy in hopes of favor. The room felt poisoned with greed and curiosity, every face twisted by the desire to see a scandal play out to the very end. I sat still, my back straight, my hands folded, because I knew one thing. This was only the second act of a story Clarence had set in motion long before he left this earth. The conference room emptied slowly, like a battlefield after the clash of armies. Some left whispering with smug satisfaction, others shaking their heads, muttering about Clarence's audacity. A few tried to linger near me, testing if I might share a word or a crumb of information, but my silence made them scatter. The woman with the boy didn't move for a long while. She sat rigid in her chair, her face blotched from tears, her eyes fixed on the polished surface of the table as if the wood itself might offer answers. When she finally rose, she did so with a trembling dignity, her hand never leaving the boy's shoulder. She walked out ahead of me, her heels clicking against the floor, sharp and brittle like glass about to shatter. For a moment I thought she would vanish into the crowd outside, But instead she paused at the doorway, glanced back as if to measure me, then pushed forward without a word. I followed at my own pace. Outside, the air was heavy with the smell of car exhaust and rain that hadn't yet fallen. The city's rhythm carried on as though nothing extraordinary had happened, but within me, the world felt irreversibly tilted. I could still hear the lawyer's voice repeating the terms, could still see the stunned faces when Clarence's decision became clear. He had not chosen love or loyalty or even justice. He had chosen legacy, and he had done it in a way that cut through every bond we thought we understood. The boy, who had walked beside his mother without a clue of what had been spoken, was now tied to my life whether either of us liked it or not. Clarence's hand reached from the grave, pulling us all into a future he alone had designed. That evening I returned to the house Clarence and I had shared for nearly 3 decades. It looked the same as always, the white paint, the porch swing, the magnolia tree bending under its own blossoms, but to me it no longer felt like home. It felt like a stage where every lie had been rehearsed, every betrayal polished to a shine. I stepped inside, hung my coat on the rack, and let the silence wash over me. The house was too large for one person, and now, cruelly, I knew it was meant to be shared with someone who wasn't even mine. The thought settled like lead in my stomach. I walked through the rooms slowly, touching furniture, framed photographs, books that smelled of dust and time. Everywhere I looked I saw Clarence, and yet I also saw the absence he had left. He hadn't trusted me fully. He hadn't loved me fully. He hadn't been the man I thought I had married. Word spread quickly in Atlanta. The will became the story of the week among neighbors, colleagues, church members, and even the corner store clerk who greeted me with too much sympathy in his eyes. People relished scandal more than tragedy, and Clarence had given them both. I overheard comments in grocery aisles, felt the weight of stares in the pews on Sunday, noticed the pauses in conversations when I entered a room. They weren't mourning him anymore. They were dissecting him and by extension dissecting me. To them I wasn't just a widow. I was a woman humiliated, a figure to be pitted, scrutinized, and quietly judged. The woman and the boy became subjects of gossip too, their names whispered with relish, their lives picked apart without mercy. I began to wonder if Clarence had known this would happen, if some bitter part of him had wanted us all exposed. At night I lay awake, the ceiling above me dark and unyielding, while memories fought with reality. I remembered Clarence's laughter, the way he used to dance clumsily in the kitchen, the way he held our daughter when she was small. And then I remembered the silence, the absences, the vague excuses, the faint smell of perfume that wasn't mine on his jackets. All the pieces fit together now, but too late. I wanted to be angry, but anger couldn't find a foothold. It slid away, leaving only exhaustion and a strange emptiness that gnawed at me like hunger. The woman did not vanish as I half expected she might. Within days she appeared again, not at my doorstep but at the grocery store, standing in the same aisle as me, her cart filled with simple food, milk, bread, fruit for the boy. Our eyes met for the briefest second, and in that glance lay everything words could not carry. She looked tired but not broken. She looked defiant, though her earlier tears still echoed in the lines of her face. I turned away first, pretending to examine cans on the shelf, but my pulse quickened. She was no longer just a stranger. She was a shadow woven into my life, and no amount of distance would undo it. The lawyer called me 2 days later, his voice measured as always. He explained the logistics of the trust, the meetings that would be required, the documents that needed signatures. The boy was the central figure now, and by Clarence's design, so was I. There would be guardianship questions, financial oversight, and a responsibility I had never asked for. As he spoke, I realized Clarence had not simply divided his fortune. He had chained us together, forcing us to navigate each other's presence long after he was gone. It wasn't an inheritance. It was a sentence. I sat in the living room after that call, staring at the family Bible resting on the shelf, a relic of a faith I still held but struggled to feel. My daughter's photo smiled from a silver frame nearby, her children already grown, their lives untouched by this storm. I wondered what Clarence had thought when he wrote those words, when he chose to give so much to a child who was not mine but was undeniably his. Did he believe it would redeem him? Did he think it would heal the fractures he had created? Or did he simply want to control us one last time? These questions circled endlessly, like birds that never found a place to land. The community waited for the drama to peak, but I knew it was only beginning. The boy's future was now entangled with mine, the woman's presence a constant reminder of what Clarence had hidden. Every step forward would be watched, every decision weighed, every word measured. I realized then that grief was not the hardest part. Living with the truth was. And truth, once spoken, could never be buried again. The days after the reading of the will unfolded with a strange rhythm, as though the city around me pulsed forward but my life had been caught in a tide that refused to let me go. The lawyer called again, this time summoning both me and the woman to his office to discuss the legal framework that Clarence had left behind. I dreaded the meeting, yet a quiet part of me wanted to face her, to look into the eyes of the person who had shared years of my husband's life without my knowledge. When I entered the office, she was already there, seated stiffly across the table, the boy sketching quietly in a notebook beside her. She didn't look at me at first, but I studied her carefully. She was younger than me, though not by decades, and her face carried the kind of beauty time had not yet managed to dull. But it was not her appearance that struck me most. It was the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the lines of someone who had carried too many secrets for too long. The lawyer spoke in his usual precise tone, outlining the structure of the trust. The boy was the primary beneficiary, but as he was a minor, guardianship and financial oversight would be necessary. By Clarence's design, I was one of the named overseers. It meant that our lives would intersect constantly, that every decision about the boy's future would pass through me. It was a cruel twist, one that Clarence must have known would tighten the knot between us. The woman finally looked up then, her gaze steady, her lips pressed tight as though holding back words. I kept my face still, my posture firm, but inside I could feel the ground shifting. It wasn't enough that Clarence had betrayed me. He had made me responsible for the evidence of his betrayal. After the meeting, the lawyer lingered, his expression softer than usual. He explained, almost apologetically, that Clarence had been deliberate in these arrangements. He hadn't trusted either of us fully, and perhaps he hadn't trusted himself either. He wanted safeguards, protections, conditions that would force accountability. It was as if he had looked at his own life, at the mess he had created, and decided the only way to preserve his legacy was to bind those he had wronged together. I left the office shaken, the words echoing in my mind long after I stepped into the humid Atlanta air. Clarence hadn't chosen us out of love or forgiveness. He had chosen us out of mistrust, his last act an attempt to control what he could no longer live to witness. The tension in the community grew heavier. Neighbors who once greeted me warmly now hesitated, their eyes filled with questions they didn't dare speak aloud. The woman faced her share of whispers too, though hers carried sharper edges. She became the subject of judgmental stares at the market, muttered slurs on the street, the kind of cruelty people reserve for those they see as intruders in the sanctity of marriage. Yet she did not vanish. I saw her often at the lawyer's office, at the grocery store, once even at the library with the boy. Each time, her presence reminded me that Clarence's choices would not fade like shadows at sunset. They would remain rooted in our lives like stubborn weeds. At night, I replayed the funeral in my mind. The boy's small frame, his wide, unknowing eyes, the way his mother's tears had come unbidden when the will was read. It struck me then that the boy was the only innocent in all of this. He hadn't asked for his father's choices, hadn't asked to be thrust into the center of a conflict that would shape his childhood. And yet, because of Clarence's decisions, he would grow up with the knowledge that he was both a bridge and a wedge between two women who had never wanted to share the same room. The thought kept me awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the old house that now felt both like a fortress and a prison. The woman finally reached out, though not in words. One morning I found a small envelope slipped into my mailbox. Inside was a handwritten note, simple, almost stark. She wrote that she had never wanted things to unfold this way, that she did not seek to humiliate me, and that her only concern now was the boy. There was no apology, only an acknowledgement of the damage Clarence had caused. I held the note in my hands for a long time, reading it again and again, searching for meaning between the lines. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was the closest thing to honesty I had received since Clarence's death. I tucked it into the family Bible, unsure whether it was forgiveness I was storing or a reminder of wounds that would never heal. The lawyer scheduled another meeting, this time with both families present. Clarence's siblings, cousins, and distant relatives arrived with their grievances and their greed, voices rising in complaint about being left with so little. The room filled with noise, accusations thrown like stones, bitterness spilling across the polished oak table. Through it all, the lawyer remained calm, reading each clause with measured precision, reminding them that Clarence's choices were final. Yet I watched as their anger twisted, not just toward Clarence but toward me and the woman. We had become the unwilling guardians of his wealth, and for that they would hold us responsible. By the time the meeting ended, I understood something I had not wanted to face. This was no longer just about inheritance. It was about survival. Clarence had left us wealth, but he had also left us exposed, vulnerable to judgment, envy, and the corrosive nature of greed. The boy, with his innocent sketches and quiet eyes, was the center of it all, the symbol of a legacy built on betrayal. And as I walked out of that room, the woman beside me, our steps awkwardly aligned, I realized that whether we liked it or not, we were bound together in a story neither of us had chosen, but both of us would have to endure. The last meeting at the lawyer's office carried a weight unlike the others. Weeks had passed since the funeral, yet the grief and anger had not dulled. They had only hardened, like clay left too long in the sun. I entered the room knowing it would be the final time Clarence's decisions were laid bare, but I was unprepared for the storm that waited. The lawyer sat behind his desk, the same neat piles of documents before him, but his expression carried a gravity that warned us this would not be routine. The mistress was already seated, the boy again beside her, his restless hands folded in his lap. Clarence's extended relatives filled the chairs and lined the walls, their eyes sharp with expectation, their voices rising in low murmurs that carried the sting of resentment. When the lawyer began, the room fell into silence. He spoke slowly, carefully, as though each word had been measured in advance. Clarence, he explained, had left a sealed letter, not to be opened until all other matters of the estate had been resolved. It was his final statement, his explanation for the decisions he had made. The lawyer broke the seal and unfolded the pages, his voice steady as he read aloud. Clarence wrote that he had known the end was near long before any of us had realized it. He admitted to mistakes, to betrayals that had left wounds he could not heal in life. He confessed that he no longer trusted the adults closest to him, his wife, his mistress, even his own siblings, because too much had been built on anger, secrecy, or greed. His only trust remained in the innocence of the next generation. The words stung as though spoken directly to me. I felt the room sway as the lawyer read that Clarence had designed the trust not as punishment, but as protection. He wanted the wealth he had built, flawed as it was, to serve as a foundation for children and grandchildren, not as fuel for grudges or competition. He acknowledged that by binding me to the oversight of the boy's inheritance, he had placed a heavy burden on me. Yet he insisted it was because I alone had proven through decades of endurance that I would not squander responsibility. The mistress shifted in her chair, her composure cracking as tears slid silently down her cheeks. The boy looked confused, his wide eyes darting between us, not yet old enough to grasp the depth of what was unfolding. Clarence's letter turned then, speaking directly of me. He wrote that he had failed me as a husband, that he had allowed temptation and selfishness to erode the foundation of our marriage. He admitted he had not been brave enough to face me with the truth, and that leaving the letter was a coward's attempt at closure. But he insisted that in life he had always known my strength was greater than his, and that in death he needed that strength to protect what remained of his name. The room was silent as the lawyer's voice softened at the closing lines. Clarence wrote that his fortune was never meant to divide. It was meant to give the next generation, our children, their children, even the boy now seated beside his mother, the chance to build lives untainted by his failures. He pleaded, almost desperately, that we let go of our battles and see the children as his true legacy. When the letter ended, the silence stretched unbearably. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the most bitter relatives seemed shaken, their anger temporarily disarmed by the raw honesty of Clarence's words. I sat rigid, the paper echo of his voice pressing against me like a tide I could not stop. I wanted to hate him, to dismiss his letter as too little, too late. Yet part of me recognized the truth in his confession. He had been weak, but he had also tried, in his flawed way, to give something better to those who would follow. The mistress covered her face with her hands, her shoulders trembling. The boy leaned against her, uncertain but instinctively protective, as though he already sensed that her grief was not only for Clarence but for the fragile path ahead. The lawyer cleared his throat, bringing us back to the present. He explained that the estate would be settled accordingly, that the trusts would be managed as Clarence had instructed, and that the oversight roles would stand. No one challenged him. Perhaps they knew there was little point, or perhaps they understood, as I did, that Clarence's letter had closed the matter more firmly than any legal stamp could. Slowly the relatives filed out, their faces clouded but subdued. The mistress lingered, hesitant, her eyes red and swollen. For the first time since this ordeal began, she looked directly at me without defensiveness or defiance. There was only exhaustion, a silent acknowledgement that we were both victims of the same man's choices. In the weeks that followed, I found myself returning often to the thought of the children. My own grandchildren, and the boy who now carried Clarence's name in his blood. I did not forgive Clarence in those days, nor did I forgive the woman who had shared him. But I began to understand that the only way forward was to honor what Clarence had written, however clumsily he had expressed it. The inheritance was not mine to hoard or to waste in bitterness. It was meant to build futures, to lift the next generation beyond the shadows we carried. I began setting aside funds for education, for opportunities that would outlast me. And though it pained me, I did not exclude the boy. He was as much a part of Clarence's legacy as my own grandchildren, and the letter had made it impossible to deny. Standing in my quiet house, I often felt Clarence's absence like a hollow in the walls, a reminder of promises broken and years misspent. But I also felt a strange clarity. The lawyer's words, the letter's plea, had shifted something in me. I could not undo the past, but I could shape what remained. And in that decision, painful as it was, I found the first fragile threads of peace. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.